July 1979. Northern Indiana was wrapped in a slow humming heat that made the air look alive. Asphalt shimmered, telephone poles buzzed, and the fields beyond the cul-de-sac smelled of sun-baked corn and gasoline. 10-year-old Michael Richardson and his 8-year-old brother Jamie had spent the afternoon circling the block on their matching Schwinn bikes, chrome handles, red frames, streamers catching the light. Their mother watched from the porch, one hand shielding her eyes, until they turned the corner and disappeared behind the line of maples at the edge of the neighborhood. It was just another summer day, she would later say, no different from 100 before it. But by nightfall, nothing about it would feel ordinary again. When the boys failed to return for dinner, their father, Gary Richardson, thought it was simple mischief. Maybe they'd gone down to Miller's Pond or followed the freight line past the water tower. He drove in slow loops through the back roads, headlights sweeping across cattails and drainage ditches, calling their names into the dark. By midnight, neighbors joined the search, flashlights cutting through the humid night like thin blades. The county sheriff's office launched a full-scale operation at dawn. Bloodhounds tracked the scent up to the edge of the pond and lost it there. 2 bicycles were found upright against a rusted fence post, their kickstands still down, as if the boys had simply paused for a moment and vanished into the air. For weeks, volunteers combed every square mile of brush, draining part of the pond, dredging ditches, checking old barns and abandoned silos. Nothing. No bodies, no clothes, no sign of struggle, only silence. The disappearance of the Richardson brothers became one of the most haunting missing person cases in Midwestern history, freezing a family in perpetual twilight. Their parents divorced 3 years later. The house was sold. The bikes went to evidence storage and stayed there for decades. And then, 31 years later, Gary Richardson, now a retired machinist living alone in Fort Wayne, received a phone call that reopened everything he thought he'd buried. When Gary picked up the phone that autumn morning in 2010, the voice on the other end sounded hesitant, almost apologetic. It belonged to a woman from a small sheriff's department in northern Michigan. They were reviewing old cold cases during a jurisdictional merger, she explained, and something had come up, something linked to his sons. Gary froze. For a moment he couldn't tell if it was hope or dread tightening his chest. He had trained himself not to react, not to let his mind build pictures anymore. But as she spoke, the images returned anyway. The red bikes, the pond, the flashlights cutting through fog. The deputy said they'd found a storage shed off a logging road near Traverse City, abandoned for years. Inside, beneath layers of dust and mildew, was a sealed metal trunk. Within it, a collection of children's clothes from the late 1970s, Polaroid photos, and a hand-carved wooden toy with the initials MR burned into its underside. Gary didn't speak for a full minute. When he finally did, his voice broke. "I'll come there myself," he said. The following week, he made the 5-hour drive north alone. The same faded map of the region folded on the passenger seat, the same directions he'd once used when he still believed the boys might be wandering somewhere out there. The sheriff's office was small, one of those modular buildings with thin walls and humming fluorescent lights. The lead investigator, Detective Karen Holt, met him at the door. She was in her 40s, deliberate in speech, with the wary empathy of someone who'd seen too many parents like him, people whose lives were divided into before and after. She explained that the shed belonged to a property once owned by a man named Robert Wexler, a long-haul truck driver who'd lived alone until his death in 1998. He'd had prior arrests, nothing violent, mostly trespassing and petty theft, but what drew attention was his connection to several missing children cases stretching from Indiana to Wisconsin in the late 70s. Holt opened a file and slid a photo across the table. A grainy Polaroid. 2 boys standing beside an old pickup truck, faces half in shadow, their clothes matching those listed in the original report. Gary leaned forward. His breath caught. "That's them," he whispered. "That's my boys." For the next several hours, the interview room became a time capsule. Maps, case files, and evidence bags spread across the table as Gary tried to recall every possible link. Neighbors, strangers, names mentioned in passing 30 years earlier. Wexler, it turned out, had driven freight routes through Gary's hometown during the exact summer of the disappearance. But the question wasn't just where he'd been. It was why the discovery had surfaced now. Forensics teams found more than photos inside that trunk. They found soil samples, ticket stubs, and fragments of cassette tape recordings, voices too distorted to identify but unmistakably belonging to children. The media never heard about it. The department kept the find under quiet investigation, afraid of reigniting a decades-old panic. Yet for Gary, the silence was unbearable. After 3 decades of absence, the void had finally spoken, and he couldn't turn away. He rented a motel room outside Traverse City, room 7 at the Pinecrest Lodge, and began retracing everything himself. Each morning, he'd drive to the old property where the shed had been found, now overtaken by birch trees and weeds. The lock had been cut, the floorboards sagged under his weight, and in the dim corners, he saw things the official reports hadn't mentioned. Scratches in the wood, initials carved at child height, a faded calendar pinned to the wall with July 1979, circled twice in red pencil. By the time Detective Holt filed her preliminary report, the story had already begun to take on a strange shape, one that didn't quite fit the patterns of any known offender. The shed, though registered to Robert Wexler, sat on property originally leased through a third party, a man named Clarence Dodd, now deceased, whose records tied back to a shuttered logistics company that handled shipments across several Midwestern states in the 1970s. When the FBI's VICAP unit cross-referenced the area, they unearthed at least 4 other missing child cases with overlapping markers, same time frame, similar locations, and the same telltale detail: bicycles left standing upright, untouched. Gary stayed in Michigan longer than the department had advised. He rented a second motel room, one wall covered in photocopied maps, another in photographs. He spoke little to anyone except Holt, who had begun to feel more like a reluctant ally than an investigator. She'd been assigned to the case late, inheriting 3 decades of contradictory paperwork, and she admitted off the record that the department had buried older leads to avoid federal attention. "There's something institutional about it," she said one night in the motel parking lot, cigarette glowing in the dark. "Like someone didn't want this pattern connected." Gary stared at her, then at the woods stretching beyond the road. "You think he had help?" She hesitated. "I think whoever did this wasn't acting alone." Forensic techs continued to analyze the trunk's contents. The cassette fragments were reconstructed digitally, revealing bits of ambient noise, truck engines idling, a child coughing, and the faint echo of a radio announcer reading local weather reports dated July 1979. It wasn't enough to confirm the boys' presence, but it placed the recordings within hours of their disappearance. The Polaroids were authenticated. The camera type matched one Wexler had owned, found decades earlier in his storage unit. Yet no direct evidence, no DNA, no remains had surfaced. It was as if the world had erased every physical trace except for its emotional residue. Meanwhile, Gary began recording his own diary entries each night, his voice shaking through a handheld tape recorder, his dreams, his theories, his grief. He started visiting the pond where the boys' bikes had been found, still fenced off, overgrown now with cattails and algae. He'd sit on the hood of his truck for hours, waiting for something, anything that felt like an answer. Sometimes he thought he heard them, laughter carried by the wind, splashes in the reeds, the metallic click of a bicycle chain. "Memory is a cruel thing," he wrote in one of the tapes. "It plays back the moment, but not the reason." By winter, Holt's team discovered something buried deeper in Wexler's personal archive. Receipts from a rest stop near Gary's hometown, dated within 24 hours of the disappearance. In the margin of one receipt, scrawled in red pen, was a list of coordinates. When plotted on a modern map, they formed a triangle encompassing the pond, the train line, and a now demolished auto repair shop, once owned by a man named Vincent Kerr. Kerr had been questioned in '79, but never charged. His statement at the time had been simple. "I saw 2 boys talking to a man in a blue truck. They looked like they knew him." That line had sat buried in a forgotten transcript for 3 decades. Holt retrieved it, and suddenly the shape of the mystery changed again. The following week, Gary accompanied her to what was left of the old repair lot, just a slab of concrete half reclaimed by grass. Local archives confirmed Kerr had vanished himself in 1982, 2 months after Wexler's last confirmed route through Indiana. The 2 men had never been officially linked, But when the FBI digitized fingerprint samples from both their old employment records, their partial match appeared. One print found on the Polaroid's edge belonging not to Wexler, but to Kerr. It was the first new physical evidence in over 30 years. Gary sat in silence as Holt told him, the motel television flickering in the background. "So what does that mean?" he asked. "It means," she said quietly, "there might have been more than one monster." Outside, snow began to fall, muffling the sound of traffic on the nearby highway. Somewhere between the static and silence, the truth was beginning to surface, but it would demand a price Gary hadn't yet imagined. By early spring 2011, the investigation had split into two paths. One remained inside the cold case office in Michigan, buried under paperwork and chain of custody disputes. The other lived out of Gary's motel room, where evidence maps overlapped on the walls like layers of a fading dream. Every morning, he'd wake to the hum of the vending machine outside and the rustle of case files scattered on the bed. Detective Holt called it obsession. Gary called it purpose. Somewhere in that paper labyrinth, he believed, lay the final trace of his sons. Around this time, a parallel inquiry began to unfold, led by a retired journalist named Sam Ridder, who'd once covered the original 1979 disappearance for the Herald-Post. Ridder, now in his 60s, had spent decades collecting his own files, clippings, and unsolved case notes from across the Midwest. He reached out to Gary after reading about the Michigan Shed in a small circulation blog for amateur sleuths. When they met at a diner off Route 31, Ridder brought a single envelope and a quiet certainty. "You were never supposed to find them," he said. Inside the envelope were photographs of a convoy of trucks, Wexler's freight line among them, parked near a rural facility in Illinois that no longer existed. The site had been a private agricultural warehouse, but according to Ridder's research, it had also received federal contracts in 1978-79 related to chemical storage, a cover operation with limited oversight. Employees from that period had since scattered, and many of the associated documents were sealed or destroyed. What caught Gary's attention wasn't the location. It was a detail barely visible in one of the grainy photos, a child's bicycle leaning against a loading dock. Same model, same color, red Schwinn. The image was dated 2 weeks after his sons disappeared. Holt at first dismissed the connection. Too circumstantial, too distant. But Ridder pressed on, tracing surviving records through state archives and private databases. A pattern began to emerge. Small logistics contractors with overlapping management, all tied through shell companies to a defunct transport firm known as Northfield Transit. And Wexler, the truck driver, had drawn paychecks from it under a pseudonym. In April, Holt traveled with Gary to the coordinates Ridder had identified. The land was fenced off, reclaimed by brush, but traces of concrete and drainage still cut through the soil. Local hunters told them the warehouse had been demolished in the early 80s after some sort of EPA thing. No one knew the details. Gary walked the perimeter alone, boot soles sinking into thawing mud. "They were here," he murmured. Holt didn't answer. Back in Traverse City, lab analysis of the cassette tapes revealed another layer, audio beneath the original track, likely recorded over an earlier tape. Forensic technicians isolated fragments, voices of adults speaking over a CB radio, referencing cargo drop and transfer north. The timestamps matched mid-July 1979. It wasn't proof of abduction, but it suggested the boy's disappearance might have intersected with something far larger than anyone had assumed, an illegal transport operation masked as freight logistics. Ridder speculated about human trafficking before it had a name in public vocabulary. Holt resisted that angle, unwilling to make a claim she couldn't prove. But the more they uncovered, the clearer it became that someone somewhere had wanted the Richardson case to disappear. Then came the night Gary received the letter. No return address, no postmark, only a folded sheet of paper slipped under his motel door. The handwriting was careful, almost delicate. "You don't know what you're looking for, but you're close. Check the quarry on County Road 9 midnight. Come alone." Holt wanted to dismiss it as a hoax. Every reopened case attracted them. But Gary didn't. That night, under a low silver moon, he drove out to the old quarry, headlights cutting through mist. The air smelled of wet stone and pine. He parked at the edge and waited. Midnight passed. Then, in the beam of his flashlight, he saw it, half buried in the silt near the waterline, a small object glinting under the surface. He waded in, shoes filling with cold water, and pulled it free. A rusted lunchbox, red metal, dented but intact. The initials were still visible, scratched faintly into the lid. J.R. Jamie Richardson. The lunchbox changed everything. Inside, sealed by years of rust and sediment, investigators found a handful of relics that felt like artifacts from another life. A fragment of a torn baseball card, a matchbox from a truck stop in Joliet, and a roll of undeveloped 35mm film. Holt hand-carried the film to a state lab in Lansing. The technicians worked carefully hour after hour, peeling apart layers of corrosion until faint images emerged. A series of interior shots, cement walls, metal shelving, a doorway marked with a painted number 12. In 2 frames, blurry but unmistakable, stood one of the missing boys, a reflection caught in a mirror behind whoever held the camera. The timestamp on the film canister, July 17, 1979, 4 days after the disappearance. When Holt showed the photos to Gary, he didn't cry. He just stared at them until his fingers went white around the edges. "They were alive," he whispered. After that day, they were still alive. The discovery reignited the case, drawing federal attention that the small Michigan department had never wanted. Within weeks, the FBI reopened the Richardson file, citing new physical evidence and potential cross-state criminal activity. But almost immediately, something shifted. Reports began to vanish from digital archives. Evidence requests were delayed or denied. Holt's supervisor warned her to step back before this goes political. She didn't. She and Gary continued quietly, using Ridder's old network of sources, retired drivers, warehouse clerks, union men who remembered whispers of shipments that weren't on the books. One contact described a night run in 1979 that carried locked crates marked as lab materials. The route ran from Indiana north through Illinois and ended, according to faded manifests, at the demolished warehouse near Traverse City. And among those listed as auxiliary drivers was the name Vincent Kerr, the same man whose print had surfaced on the Polaroid. The implication was clear. Wexler hadn't been alone. There had been a system, and it had operated in plain sight. Meanwhile, Gary began receiving anonymous calls on his motel landline, brief, distorted voices, the sound of engines in the background, then silence. Once he returned to his room to find the wall map gone, every pin stripped out, the door still locked from the inside. Holt reported it, but the motel clerk swore no one had entered. "You're not supposed to be digging here," one caller finally said before hanging up. The tension fractured something in Gary. He stopped eating, stopped sleeping. Each night he drove to the quarry, headlights off, staring at the black water where the lunchbox had been buried. Holt followed protocol, requested departmental protection. It was denied. "Not a credible threat," her captain wrote. Then 2 weeks later, Ridder vanished. He told Holt he was driving to Chicago to meet a former Northfield Transit dispatcher who'd kept something all these years. He never arrived. His car was found outside a rest stop off I-196. Driver's door open, keys still in the ignition. The only thing missing was the briefcase containing his files. The media barely noticed. Another retired reporter lost on the road. But Holt knew better. Gary drove down himself, stood by the empty car and said only, "They're erasing it again." The next day, Holt received a flash drive in the mail. No return label. Inside were scanned documents, employment rosters, payment ledgers, and one grainy photo of a group of men outside the same demolished warehouse. 2 faces were identifiable, Wexler and Kerr. But there was a third figure, blurred yet tall, wearing a deputy's badge. A name scrawled underneath in fading ink, Lieutenant J. Garrison, LPD. The initials matched an officer who had led the original 1979 search in Gary's hometown. Holt ran his record. He'd retired in 1985, moved to Arizona, died in 2001. But the connection was undeniable. It meant that whatever happened to the Richardson boys had crossed not just county lines, but the very institutions meant to protect them. Late that night, Gary sat alone with the printed photo, the hum of the motel heater filling the silence. He thought of his son's laughter echoing down the cul-de-sac, of the way Jamie's bike streamers had caught the sun. And for the first time in 31 years, he let himself ask the question he'd buried deepest. What if they never meant for me to find them? What if someone else already had? By the time spring rolled into summer 2011, Gary was a ghost of himself. He shaved his beard with a disposable razor in the motel sink, his eyes fixed on the reflection of a man he barely recognized. The motel staff stopped cleaning his room months ago. On the walls, maps, transcripts, strings connecting dates, places, and names grew like veins of obsession. In the center, pinned under a thumbtack, was the photo of the lunchbox, a single line scrawled beneath it in ink. They kept moving them. Holt was the only person who still visited. She'd stopped bringing her badge. Every time she came, she checked the parking lot first, watching for the same dark sedan that had followed her twice from the precinct. Her instincts told her the case had reached a point where the danger no longer came from what they might find, but from who already knew. One evening, she arrived to find Gary sitting on the floor holding a cassette tape. "It came today," he said. The envelope had no return address, but inside was a tape labeled only July 20th. Holt borrowed an old player from the front desk, set it on the table, pressed play. At first only static, then faintly voices. Two adult men talking over a CB channel, the background filled with engine noise. A child's voice cuts in, a single line, "Can we go home now?" Silence. Then one of the men replies, "Quiet down. It's not much farther." Holt hit pause. Her hands shook. The timestamp matched 5 days after the brothers had vanished. When the lab analyzed the audio, the results were worse. The recording originated from a unit assigned in 1979 to a law enforcement vehicle registered to Lake County, Gary's own jurisdiction at the time. That detail never reached the public. Someone inside had helped move the boys. Whether for ransom, experiment, or something darker, no one could yet tell. And then, as the pressure mounted, the department intervened. The case was pulled from Holt's hands, reclassified under federal review. She was placed on administrative leave, pending a psychological evaluation. Her files, every photo, note, and report, were seized for reprocessing. 2 days later, Gary's motel room was found emptied, the wall maps stripped bare. No sign of forced entry, no fingerprints. The manager said he'd seen him drive off at dawn in his pickup heading south, but security footage from the highway toll showed no such vehicle passing through. Gary Richardson was gone. For the next 3 months, Holt, suspended, cut off, discredited, worked alone. She followed Ritter's last breadcrumb, tracking down the family of the dead officer Lieutenant Garrison. His daughter agreed to meet her at a diner in Flagstaff. She brought a box of her father's old effects, badges, letters, and a leather-bound notebook that had survived decades of desert heat. Inside were fragments of what looked like coded entries, dates, initials, coordinates. But one page stopped Holt cold. It read RW plus VK confirmed delivery. Site 12 secured. Kids stable. 719. Beneath it a final line, scribbled so faintly it nearly disappeared into the paper. Transfer complete. "Don't call me again." Holt stared at it until her reflection blurred in the diner window. Stable. The word didn't make sense, unless the boys had been alive longer than anyone believed. Unless the operation they'd uncovered hadn't been about killing at all, but containing. She photocopied the page and mailed the original back to the family, then packed her car and drove north again, back to where it had begun. The shed was gone, bulldozed, the land posted for sale, but Holt parked anyway, stood among the birch trees and listened. For the first time she thought she could hear it. The hum of trucks long since silenced, the echo of a world that had rewritten its own crime into myth. That night she received an email from an untraceable account. 3 words. You found them. No attachments. No sender ID, just that. 2 weeks after that final anonymous email, a call came to Holt's temporary number, an old prepaid phone she used off the record. The voice on the other end was male, older, cautious. He identified himself only as Ray, claiming to be a retired state contractor. "You're looking in the right places," he said, "but for the wrong reason." When Holt pressed him, he added one phrase before hanging up. "They weren't taken. They were moved." It was cryptic, but it shifted the axis of her investigation. She spent days re-examining everything she thought she knew. The shed, the warehouse, the transfer north, the word stable in Garrison's notes. Each clue seemed less like evidence of murder and more like evidence of containment, as if the boys had been part of something the system couldn't acknowledge. Then came the records, buried deep in state archives, stamped with clearance codes from a defunct agency, labeled Project Harland, operational between 1976 and 1980. Most files were blacked out, but one memo misfiled in a box of public health documents mentioned juvenile relocations connected to experimental exposure protocols. The sites listed matched the same coordinates as Wexler's trucking routes. It wasn't child trafficking. It was something colder. Government-sanctioned field tests involving rural populations, later scrubbed from history. The Richardson boys had stumbled into a classified zone the day they rode their bikes beyond the Maples. Holt pieced together the implication. Local law enforcement had been instructed to neutralize public disruption, meaning cover up the disappearance, silence witnesses, and destroy all trace of the project. Wexler and Kerr weren't predators, they were contractors, and when the project collapsed under scrutiny in 1980, every participant vanished, some reassigned, others quietly removed. The children? Transferred north. Gary, meanwhile, had not vanished in the ordinary sense. In late 2011, a man matching his description was admitted under an alias to a private medical facility outside Duluth, Minnesota. No ID, no next of kin. He was found wandering near a state forest road, disoriented, clutching a photo of 2 boys. Local staff identified him only through dental records months later, after Holt pressed the bureau for cross-matching. When she arrived, she found him alive but hollowed, his memory fragmented. "They showed me something," he said over and over, staring through her. They were alive, but not the same. He couldn't explain what he meant, only that he'd been brought to a place and told to stop asking questions. When Holt searched for Project Harland again, the database entry was gone, deleted overnight. Even her credentials were revoked. By then, Ridder's disappearance, Wexler's death, Kerr's print, and Garrison's notebook had been recast by officials as a web of unrelated coincidences. The case was once again resolved, meaning sealed. Holt resigned within the year. But she kept one thing, the photocopy of Garrison's entry dated July 19, 1979. She mailed it anonymously to a journalist she trusted, along with copies of the photos from the film roll and a handwritten note. "If you're reading this, it means they finally buried it. Don't let them." That journalist, decades later, would be the one narrating this story, the one piecing together the fragments of a father, a detective, and 2 brothers who rode their bikes into history and never came home. In the final recovered interview from Holt's tapes, her voice trembles slightly. "Maybe they didn't die," she says. "Maybe they were erased from one world to live in another, one no one was meant to see." For years, the files sat buried in a climate-controlled vault, unlabeled among thousands of unrelated archives. Then in 2014, a low-level contractor digitizing state records flagged a mislabeled reel of microfilm marked Harland 79, Richardson. It should have gone unnoticed. But protocol required cross-checking, and the name triggered an automated alert in the Bureau's dormant cold case database. Within 24 hours, 2 federal agents visited the archive. Within 48, the reel disappeared, but not before the contractor, an intern named Laura Jensen, made a backup. 3 months later, she mailed that copy to an address she found on an old news article. Detective Karen Holt, Traverse City PD, Rhett. By then, Holt was living off the grid in Wisconsin, teaching part-time at a community college under her maiden name. The package arrived wrapped in plain paper with a single note. "They're still here." On the reel were fragments of a film, grainy 16mm footage labeled only Observation Log 12, July 21, 1979. The footage showed a warehouse interior, concrete floor, high windows sealed with tin, a line of metal cots. On one of them, unmistakable, sat Jamie Richardson. Beside him, an older boy, Michael, his hand resting protectively on his brother's shoulder. A man in uniform entered the frame, clipboard in hand. His face was obscured, but on his sleeve the patch was clear. Harland Program, Civil Defense Research Division. The footage ended abruptly, the film snapping into static. Holt sat motionless for a long time before calling Gary. His voice on the other end was quieter than she remembered, slowed by medication, but lucid. "I told you," he whispered. "They didn't die there." The next morning she drove to Minnesota to show him the footage. The old facility where he lived was sterile, quiet, snow pushing against the windows. When she played the video on her laptop, Gary leaned forward slowly, eyes fixed on the flickering image of his sons, frozen in time. Then he said something that would alter the course of the investigation forever. "That place," he said, "I've seen it. I was there." He described a building deep in the woods near the Canadian border, concrete tunnels, lights humming, a smell of bleach. He remembered being escorted by men who said they were federal agents. "They told me to stop asking questions," he said. "But one of them took me downstairs. There were rooms. I saw 2 boys through glass. They looked like them, Karen, but older." Holt asked when this happened. He said it was the summer of 2010, the same year the shed was found. She tried to confirm it, but no facility matching that description existed on any map. No federal property records, nothing. And yet a week later, a satellite photo obtained through a Freedom of Information request showed a clearing near the coordinates Gary mentioned. Perfectly circular, trees felled in concentric patterns, the ground scorched as if from demolition. The file was time-stamped 1 month after Gary's alleged visit. Project Harlan's final cleanup. They erased the experiment, Holt said quietly. And everything in it. But the strangest detail came from the last frame of the film, one that technicians overlooked at first. As the man with the clipboard turns away, another figure appears briefly in the background, a man standing in the doorway, looking directly into the camera. The photo analysis later confirmed what neither Holt nor Gary wanted to believe. The man's features matched Gary Richardson himself, 20 years younger than he should have been. His face drawn but unmistakable. The image of Gary's younger face on that film became the fracture line in everything Holt thought she understood. It made no logical sense. Temporal gaps, misdated reels, corrupted frames, but the resemblance was undeniable. For days she couldn't sleep. She replayed the footage again and again until her computer froze, the light of the paused frame bleaching the motel walls. She started cataloging inconsistencies. The boy's clothing was newer than 1979 manufacturing tags suggested. The light filtering through the warehouse windows didn't match the solar angle of that date, and the clipboard in the man's hand carried a printed logo that hadn't existed until 1984. Someone had manipulated the record, or worse, the record itself wasn't what it appeared to be. When Holt contacted Laura Jensen, the intern who'd sent her the reel, the number was disconnected. 2 weeks later, Laura's car was found abandoned near Iron Mountain, the trunk empty, but for a single page from a security log stamped Harlan South, 1980, access terminated. The signature was unreadable. By that point, Holt understood the pattern wasn't linear. It was recursive, looping through time like an echo of an erased event. Every person who got close vanished into the same silence, the kind that feels designed. In her final field notes, later recovered from her cabin, Holt wrote, "Project Harlan wasn't about relocation. It was replication, controlled environmental exposure. Subjects monitored for adaptability. Failure meant removal. Success meant continuation." The word continuation was circled 3 times. Meanwhile, in Minnesota, Gary's condition worsened. His short-term memory collapsed into fragments. He began drawing the same pattern over and over, a ring of concentric circles around 2 small figures, always in red pencil. When Holt visited, he no longer recognized her. He called her nurse and asked if his boys had come to visit that day. In the facility's records, a note appeared under his patient file. "Night terrors. Keeps mentioning observation lights, humming noise, children's laughter in vents." Holt knew what it meant. The same hum had been described in declassified documents from Harlan's test sites, low-frequency machinery used during containment monitoring. On a stormy evening in late October 2014, a power outage hit the region. Cameras at the facility went dark for 7 minutes. When power returned, Gary's room was empty. The bed undisturbed, the window locked from the inside. No footprints, no alarms. Only a small cassette left on the nightstand, labeled "Listen." Security reports claimed it was blank. But when Holt obtained the tape months later, the playback revealed a sound she would never forget. That same steady hum beneath a child's voice whispering, "We're home now." Holt never released that tape publicly. She kept it hidden in a safe deposit box under a pseudonym, along with the reel, the photographs, and Garrison's notebook. In her last interview before disappearing herself in 2018, she told a journalist, "The hardest part isn't believing they're gone. It's wondering where the line between gone and taken really is. Because I think sometimes the world just edits itself, and the rest of us have to live with the missing footage. It would be another 8 years before anyone spoke the Richardson name again." In 2022, a redevelopment crew clearing the overgrown grounds of an old Defense Department site near the Canadian border unearthed a buried access tunnel, sealed by concrete. The coordinates matched the last location Holt had ever mentioned in her notes. At first it was treated as a routine environmental hazard, lead asbestos, forgotten Cold War infrastructure. But when drones entered the shaft, they found something far stranger, rooms still intact, power cables preserved under layers of dust. On one wall, in faded paint, were the words Site 12, Observation Unit. Inside, dozens of metal cots lined the concrete floor, each one tagged with a numbered brass plate. Most were empty. But in one sealed chamber, the team found 2 skeletal remains, juvenile side by side, still wearing fragments of red fabric. The forensic analysis later confirmed the impossible. The DNA belonged to the Richardson brothers, but the carbon dating didn't. The bones were only 15 to 20 years old, decades too new to be theirs. That anomaly ignited a new storm inside the Bureau. Unofficially, it was dismissed as lab contamination. Officially, the discovery was sealed again. Unofficially, someone leaked a series of internal memos suggesting that the Site 12 complex had been reactivated in 1995 under a new name, Division Meridian, focused on closed-loop human simulation environments. No one would say what that meant. 3 months after the find, a parcel arrived at the Fort Wayne Historical Society, addressed in shaky handwriting to the Richardson Family Archive. There was no return address. Inside was a single VHS tape, unmarked, and a small note written in blue ink, "For Gary from them." The archivist, unaware of its significance, transferred it to digital. What played on the screen remains one of the strangest and most disputed recordings ever logged in an unsolved case. The video opens with static. Then the image stabilizes, an empty field at dusk framed by trees. The camera pans slowly, shakily as if held by someone unsteady. In the distance, 2 figures appear, boys no older than 10 and 8 walking side by side, their hands pushing bicycles through tall grass. They pause, turn toward the camera and wave. Their faces are perfectly clear. They haven't aged a day since 1979. Behind them, the sun drops low, washing the field in amber light. The screen flickers. The image distorts, and a faint voice, male, older, trembling, says, "It's me. I found them." Experts later confirmed the voice matched that of Gary Richardson, but Gary had been legally declared deceased 3 years earlier. The footage has no timestamp, no metadata, no camera source. It simply exists, out of time, like a memory that refuses to decay. The official explanation was that it was a hoax, an edited composite using AI reconstruction and archival footage. But the analysts who handled it privately disagreed. The shadows, they said, didn't match any known location. The horizon line bent in ways no lens could replicate, and in the final second before the tape cuts to black, a faint reflection appears in the lens, a woman's silhouette standing beside Gary, holding a small device, the same model of audio recorder Holt had used for her field tapes. No one ever found her body. No one ever found the camera. The VHS was sealed in evidence storage until 2025, when it was quietly transferred to a private foundation studying unresolved temporal anomalies. Today, it sits in a locked archive, unviewed, its contents accessible only by federal clearance. The Richardson file remains officially unsolved. The death certificates stand. But if you drive out to the ruins of the Site 12 facility, just past the rusted fence and the overgrown road that leads nowhere, you can still see the faint outline of 2 bicycles carved into the concrete wall. Locals say that on certain nights, when the wind dies and the trees stop moving, a low hum fills the air, steady, electric, and human. They say if you listen long enough, you can hear children laughing somewhere in the dark, and a man's voice whispering, "We're home now."